Now, the rest of the story. One dreary November morning, the Gage family gathered sorrowfully around the little grave in Evergreen Memorial Cemetery, Bloomington, Illinois. The dearly departed on this particular occasion had hardly arrived. She was Dorothy Louise Gage. She had died of a rare pneumonia-like illness just 5 months to the day after she was born. Her parents, Tom and Sophie, were understandably grief-stricken. How fortunate that Tom's stalwart sister, Maud, was there to comfort them. "I don't know what I'm going to do," Sophie exclaimed to her sister-in-law over and over again at the funeral. "It would be all right," Maud reassured her. "These things take time." But what nobody then realized, perhaps not even Maud herself, was that deep down inside, where nobody could see, she was falling apart. For at some point during the train ride back to Chicago, Maud was seized by a profound tightness in her chest. Gasping for breath, she panicked, and as her terror increased, she began to sob uncontrollably, inconsolably. Her husband, Frank, was there to meet her at the train station in Chicago, and yet while he knew that the Gage family was an especially close one, and that Maud was likely to have been much moved by the funeral of her infant niece, he was completely unprepared for the state of mind in which his wife returned to him. "I should have been there with you," Frank apologized. "But you don't understand," Maud answered. And that night when the house was quiet, she related to her husband the rest of the story. They had 4 wonderful sons, she said, but secretly she had always wanted a daughter. And their niece, Dorothy Louise Gage, in her brief 5 months among them, had become the daughter that Maud would probably never have. She'd been such a beautiful baby, and yet it was not until she was gone that Maud realized how much she had meant to her. Frank nodded solemnly. He understood now, but there was nothing he could say to soothe his wife, and certainly nothing he could do to bring the infant back to life. Or was there? For Maud, grieving, remained in a doctor's care for many weeks until her wounded heart had begun to heal, and no small part of that healing was the result of something husband Frank did, the nearest thing to an outright resurrection, a gift to the baby who had left them too soon, a tribute that endures to this day. The grave of little Dorothy Louise Gage, marked by an impressive monument, even now is blanketed with flowers, has become a shrine of sorts in Evergreen Memorial Cemetery in Bloomington, visited each year by the innumerable who adore her. For the tribute that inspired all others since was a character in a story that Frank wrote, a character Frank named for the niece his wife so loved. Now, all of your life, you have been her friend, and she yours, in magical adventures down that yellow brick road. But now, whenever you think of the fictional Dorothy Gale, now you'll remember the factual Dorothy Gage, who led the way over the rainbow, the infant niece of L. Frank Baum, the author of the timeless American fairy tale entitled The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, because now you know the rest of the story.
And now the rest of the story. The Wizard of Oz has always seemed to have a life of its own. It's much more than just a book or a film. It's almost as if it's alive somehow. Learning that Dorothy was named after a real person just makes the book and film more special. Now let's take a closer look at Dorothy Louise Gage's family. Henry Hill Gage and Matilda Jocelyn Gage had 5 children. Thomas Clarkson Gage was the 2nd child, and Maud Gage was the 5th. In 1882, Maud married L. Frank Baum. In his 20s, Baum bred a fancy breed of poultry called the Hamburg chicken. Now wait, what? He was a chicken farmer? Well, yes. And 2 years before their marriage, Baum established a monthly trade journal called The Poultry Record. 4 years after their marriage, Baum published his first book, but it's not what you would expect. L. Frank Baum's first published work was The Book of the Hamburgs, a brief treatise upon the mating, rearing, and management of the different varieties of Hamburgs. During times of financial difficulty, Baum demonstrated and sold fireworks to enthused crowds. He loved to see the wonder on the faces of the children. But we'll get back to Baum later. In 1885, Thomas Gage married Sophie Jewell. Together they had 3 children. Their first daughter, Matilda Jewell Gage, was born in 1886 and lived to a ripe old age of 99. While researching the Gage family, I found this photo of Matilda holding a copy of The Wizard of Oz. Thomas and Sophie's second child, Alice Eliza Gage, was born and died on the same day, December 12, 1891. Thomas and Sophie's third child was Dorothy Louise Gage. She was born on June the 11th, 1898, in Bloomington, Illinois. Just 5 months later, November the 11th, 1898, little Dorothy died from congestion of the brain. Now, we don't use this term, congestion of the brain, anymore, but it meant that there was an obstruction, a congestion of the normal flux of blood within the blood vessel network of the brain. Now, we normally refer to this as a cerebral hemorrhage or a stroke. As Mr. Harvey explained, Baum's wife Maud returned from little Dorothy's funeral with a broken heart, and he named the character in his book, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, after her niece, Dorothy Louise Gage. Now, at the time, Baum had not yet become the famous children's book writer that he would become. In 1888, Baum opened a store in Aberdeen, South Dakota called Baum's Bazaar. Baum allowed people to charge goods on credit, which eventually led to bankruptcy. He then worked as a reporter, an editor, and even as a traveling salesman. In 1897, he published Mother Goose in Prose, which was successful enough for him to quit his job as a salesman. In 1899, the year after little Dorothy's death, Baum published Father Goose, his book, which was a collection of nonsensical poetry. It became the best-selling children's book of 1899. Now, 1900 was the year that made L. Frank Baum. It was in that year that he wrote a book which stressed the importance of using mannequins in storeroom show windows to attract customers. The art of decorating dry good windows and interiors wasn't really the page-turner that you might expect from Baum. Later that same year, Baum and illustrator W. W. Denslow published The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, which was the best-selling children's book for 2 years in a row. In 1902, it became a hit musical with the shortened title, The Wizard of Oz. The stage version was aimed more at adult audience rather than children, and the script was vastly different from the one that we would expect. We probably wouldn't even recognize it as the same tale. The lovable dog Toto was replaced with Imogene the cow. In addition to Dorothy and Imogene, a waitress called Trixie Trifle and a streetcar operator called Pastoria were also transported to the land of Oz by that tornado. There was no Wicked Witch of the West. The plot revolved around Dorothy, Imogene, Trixie, and Pastoria, who had befriended the Wizard of Oz, and the group was hunted as traitors by someone claiming to be the rightful king of Oz. But despite these differences, the stage version was a hit. Baum eventually wrote 13 novels based on the land of Oz. But now, back to little Dorothy. Until 1996, nearly 100 years after her death, little Dorothy's grave and Dorothy's connection to the Wizard of Oz was known only to a handful of people. Did you know about it? There was no way that anyone passing her grave would recognize the connection. Her small, simple headstone was lost among the other 20,000 plus headstones in the cemetery. Dr. Sally Wagner, a scholar from Aberdeen, South Dakota, where the Gage family relocated after Dorothy's death, had lectured about the Baum family and the Oz stories for decades. During her research, Dr. Wagner befriended Matilda Gage, little Dorothy's only living sibling, who also lived in Aberdeen, South Dakota. During a conversation, Dr. Wagner learned that the Gage family only lived in Bloomington, Illinois for a single year, 1898, the same year little Dorothy was born and died. Matilda told Dr. Wagner about little Dorothy's grave in Evergreen Memorial Cemetery. The next opportunity she had, Dr. Wagner headed to the Evergreen Memorial Cemetery to find little Dorothy's grave. Now remember, Dorothy's was just one small headstone among more than 20,000 graves in the cemetery. Dr. Wagner searched and searched. Finally, her persistence paid off, and she found Dorothy's small headstone. Something more was needed. In 1997, a new, larger marker was erected for little Dorothy, which showed the link between little Dorothy Gage and the Wizard of Oz. 20 years later, in 2017, officials at Evergreen Memorial Cemetery decided that an old oak tree near little Dorothy's grave had to be removed. This tree was around 200 years old. Cemetery officials saw this as a unique opportunity. Could this oak tree somehow memorialize little Dorothy? Well, in June 2018, Bill Baker of Top Notch Chainsaw Carving was given the task to carve the tree stump into Dorothy Toto in the Yellow Brick Road. Bill, the carver, said, "I knew the story about the Wizard of Oz, but I didn't know about Dorothy's connection to Bloomington, Illinois. Knowing that makes this project much more interesting and special to me." Now, if you visit Bloomington, Illinois, be sure to stop in and see the carving. It's certainly impressive. The book, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, and the film, The Wizard of Oz, are special to millions of people around the world. It's ultimately a film of hope. Like most of us do at some point during our lifetimes, we look beyond what we have for something better, maybe something more exciting. But Dorothy realized that what was most important to her, she had all along right there in Kansas. But it makes me wonder, though, had little Dorothy Louise Gage not died, had Baum's wife not returned distraught over her niece's death, would L. Frank Baum have written The Wonderful Wizard of Oz? I'm Brad Dison. Thanks for watching, and now you know the rest of the story.